Before we get into it, I need to warn you. The topic discussed here may ruffle some feathers, and if you feel the need to click off this video, then clearly you're not ready to hear what needs to be said. Strangely, this topic was hard to write. Not because there wasn't anything to say, but because so little of it felt aspiring. In my last video, talking about Adolf Hitler, I discovered unspoken truths how he became the genocidal tyrant we know him as. However, in today's topic, it's about the renowned dictator of the Soviet Union, the USSR, Joseph Stalin. Where Adolf Hitler was predictable, Stalin had already figured you out before you stepped a foot into his palace. His famous and impulsive feasts of inviting guests, while you gorged and indulged, he remained reserved, observing you and anyone else for weaknesses he could exploit, a silent interrogation to test, then judge who breaks rank or gossip. Not even devout loyalists were safe from his paranoid temptation. Because in the Soviet Union, loyalty even within the lowest class of its people were expected to be loyal to the state. But Stalin's paranoia would make that a problem. You see, in Soviet Russia there was such thing as too loyal. Being too loyal was seen as suspicious in Stalin's paranoia. Why are you so perfect? Stalin could ask himself. What's your angle? So Stalin killed even his own people indiscriminately. All because he could. Even a fictional character, Anton Slavik, a true loyalist to Kane, would have been seen with great suspicion to Stalin, because in Stalin's eyes that loyalty was just another mask, one worth removing permanently. Anyone who's paid attention to my format, I try to not write accusatory scripts. Neither do I try to downplay anything. Why's that? Because I try to understand what others may have missed. Even when those truths are uncomfortable, especially when they live within us. To help elevate our understanding of those in the past, possibly those in modern times, and ourselves as well. So, coming back to Stalin, I have a hot take. However, it's not my own. In fact, it's ChatGPT's hot take to explain Stalin's paranoia, and it resonated perfectly with today's topic. Especially given it helped me try and understand Stalin better as a person. What's this hot take? Stalin is a child, who never really learned how to grow up. His entire life was insecurity. It wasn't just a part of him. It was him. Because of all that he had to suffer from, physical deformity, disease, and the such. Despite not just being a second-class citizen as a Georgian ruling over a Russian country, he was insecure about himself because when he rose to power, he also believed he didn't belong, that he didn't earn it. And his biggest fear was someone confirming his own insecurity and then taking advantage of it. We all know Stalin perpetuated a state of absolute chaos in Soviet Russia. Again, if you weren't loyal enough, you could be killed or sent to the Gulag. But if you are also too loyal, it's the same result. The result? If the Soviet people believed in a god, they were praying they wouldn't be next. Because the executions and the transporting to gulags were literally indiscriminate. Anyone for any reason or no reason at all could experience Stalinist Russia's wrath. Beyond that, it's not like Stalin taking charge really fixed anything either. Like Germany in the 19th and 20th century, the poor were living in impoverished and wretched conditions, while the wealthy were living just perfectly fine. However, unlike Hitler, Stalin's rise to power wasn't based on a corrupt system. Well, it was corrupt, it was just different. In the meantime, allow me to bring in an old friend, someone probably more fit to talk about this.
Spasiba, brat Ludek. Privyet, audience. Where to begin? Before Stalin, the man of steel became the dictator of Moj dom Rodina, my home, the motherland. Russia was mainly farmland, despite the majority of the country being frozen wastelands, embodying peak freezing temperatures akin to that in Siberia. The poor were getting poorer, and the richer conveniently, were getting richer. It's almost predictable how this happens, You labor, they take the fruits, and their labor is just watching you work. Now, I'm not gonna say Stalin's genocide wasn't horrific, because referring to history it was. But let's be real, the elites of Russia were already sending the country down a dark road. Stalin just hit the gas. It's arguable that Stalin, despite thrusting the country towards industrialization further than it was, had saved Russia in some odd and twisted way. But saying that says Stalin had the intention, when we already know how untrue that argument is. Da? Therefore, it's more plausible Russia was saved, just inadvertently, like an accident that turned out better than it should have. In a sense, the AI's take on why Stalin was so paranoid sounds plausible. It's also plausible that in the way Stalin rose to power, he was afraid someone else would use the same tactics. But that's just speculation at best, and I'd argue, citing the AI's take, he could have felt inadequate, undeserving of ruling. But that he's a prime example of what happens when someone, not truly oppressed, but treated as second class, suddenly finds himself in charge of the very nation that once looked down on him. It's increasingly apparent that he valued his own self more than anyone else, especially his own sin. His son, who was taken prisoner by Nazi soldiers. We can debate all day what he did to Narod, the citizens, was terrible. But what Otets, father, willingly sacrifices their own sin. Thing is, that very question undermines what Stalin could have really been thinking at the time. Was he a person of unwavering pride in his position? Did he ever feel regret losing his sin? Couldn't have it been possible he knew his own semya? His family? Was going to die anyways? Nobody really knows because nobody really talks about it, let alone writes it for historical reference. All we can really do is speculate, because despite Stalin ruling over Russia, learning about Marxism, he could have really been the single person to turn Russia around for the better, as a country, a culture, and a people. Instead, it was twisted into a new form of government, taking Marxism and turning it into a very oppressive form of communism. Slava nashemu velikomu vozhdu. Praise to our benevolent leader Joseph Stalin, whilst knowingly having to pretend everything else wasn't going on. Despite the challenge, Stalin was a bit harder to grasp. It's a challenge to look past the typical, usual uncaring dictator that he did really well as. I argue if there was someone else who had identical factors to Stalin's upbringing, they probably would have done things differently. To suggest reading a book about Marxism suddenly makes you a communist is as much as a fallacy as winning the lottery and telling the world you fought hard to earn this. If anything, if Stalin's paranoia is indicative of his character, despite numerous Narod praising him as good or necessary change, he'd be remembered less as a titan of power and more as the most insecure tyrant in history, with an almost entitled sense of authority. Was nothing more than a Rebenok. A child who threw tantrums because someone hurt his feelings, when in reality, he was just a beaten-down, bullied freak of a Rebenok who suddenly became the bully himself. Do svidania, brat Ludik. Spasiba.
Hey you! Hit subscribe! And don't forget to turn on the bell notification for your daily upload alerts. Give it a share. Leave a like and make a comment.